Okay, so this is where feel lives. Timing. Your brain is highly sensitive to when sounds start, especially sharp edges like consonants, snares, and pick attacks. Micro-timing, in the few millisecond window, shapes groove, punch, and clarity. Shift in onset by 2 to 5 milliseconds and you won't hear it as late, but you'll feel the groove sag. Sharpen or soften a transient by a hair and the whole mix rebalances. That's because your auditory system uses those edges to group events and judge loudness. Transient edges are like high contrast borders in vision. They tell your brain what to track. Here's what most people miss. Analog and digital have different timing signatures when they misbehave. Turntables exhibit wow and flutter, slow and fast speed variations measured in fractions of a percent. That's pitch and time wobble. At very low levels, it doesn't sound broken. It adds a gentle movement your ear often folds into the performance, a chorus-like shimmer on sustained notes. Tape has similar, usually smaller, modulation. It's not accuracy, but it's coherent. The error is continuous, correlated across the whole signal, and your brain is great at accepting consistent, predictable deviations. Digital's classic gremlin is jitter, uncertainty in when samples are converted. In modern gear, typical jitter levels are far below audibility on music with competent design, but the signature still matters. Periodic jitter creates sidebands that can sound like faint grit around highs. Random jitter tends to blur transients a touch. Well-designed DACs push this below audibility, but upstream timing. USB electrical noise, poor clock recovery, or bad interfaces can create patterns that aren't musically related. The brain is less forgiving of uncorrelated spiky timing errors because they add unpredictable edges right where you're sensitive. Everything clicked when I compared 3 drum prints. Clean digital, digital with induced periodic jitter, and a mild tape pass. Level matched, listeners called the tape punchier but friendlier, the jittered print edgier but thinner, and the clean one sharp. The tape path actually had slightly rounded peaks and a hint of low-order harmonics that let the sustain breathe and lifted mid-band weight. The jitter path added tiny HF fuzz that competed with the snare's crack. The takeaway: timing artifacts that are smooth and level dependent can read as musical. Timing artifacts that are spiky and uncorrelated read as stress. Analog's continuous time behavior helps here. In a purely analog chain, there's no sample boundary. Transients are sculpted by bandwidths, slew rate, and saturation, not reconstructed from discrete points. Done well, digital reconstruction is transparent. But when filters, clocks, or noise shape the edge in odd ways, you can get post ringing or micro smear. It's subtle, and modern oversampling filters largely fix it. But the psychoacoustic principle stands. Your ear locks onto the earliest unmasked energy. If that onset is crisp in the midband and not followed by hash, the event feels strong without pain. Tape compression is a masterclass in microdynamics. The tiny level changes inside a note. As level climbs, tape soft knee compresses peaks more than sustain, pulling transient to body ratio into a pleasing balance. That shifts loudness perception. You hear more note center at the same peak level, so it feels louder without being harsher. On vocals, it keeps breath and tone audible, while trimming sibilant spikes. On drums, it turns stick-click into thwack. Digital can mimic this with carefully tuned soft knee compression and saturation, but the key is time constants. Fast enough to catch the spike, slow enough to release between hits, so groove breathes. This might seem backwards, but tiny timing errors can sound musical if they correlate with dynamics. A turntable's benign flutter or a transformer's level-dependent phase shift moves the image a hair in a way your brain tags as motion, not defect. By contrast, late-stage clock jitter that rides on every cymbal tick without relation to level feels like sand. The brain prefers errors that tell a story. Louder equals more bending, over errors that scribble on top at random. Micro story. I once took a sterile, in-the-box acoustic guitar and ran it through a transformer-coupled preamp, pushing just enough to tickle saturation, then a tape sim at 1.5 dB of glue. No EQ, no reverb change. Level-matched AB, 5 listeners said. The groove locked in, even though the metronome alignment didn't move. What changed was the edge shape. Pick clicks mellowed by a millisecond, sustain read clearer, and low-level noise kept the space from feeling vacuum-sealed. Same timing grid, different timing feel. In other words, microdynamics and microtiming aren't just nerd words. They're the levers your brain uses to decide comfort and impact. Keep transients meaningful, not razor wire. Let sustain carry tone. If digital feels tense, it's rarely because zeros and ones are cold. It's because the edge-to-body ratio and the timing noise around it don't match how you like to parse sound. Shape edges softly, control jitter, and give notes room to bloom, and the music steps forward without stepping on your ears. Noise you like dither, hiss, and crackle. Okay, so basically, silence isn't neutral. A totally black background can sound impressive at first and fatiguing over longer sessions. Your auditory system is always hunting for a floor, some consistent reference the brain can subtract. Give it a tiny, stable bed of noise and perception relaxes. Strip it away entirely, and every microscopic flaw stands alone like dust on a glass table. Here's what most people miss. A little noise can fix a digital problem on purpose. That's dither. When you reduce bit depth, quantization error turns quiet details into gritty, level-dependent distortion. Add an ultra-low level of random noise before the conversion, and that distortion becomes uncorrelated. Your ear hears it as smooth air, while the true, low-level information survives statistically. It's counterintuitive. We add noise to preserve detail. Vinyl gives you a naturalized version of that. The surface hiss and rumble create a consistent floor that your brain quickly models and ignores. Because it's relatively constant, it masks the ugly stuff. Sporadic converter hash, harsh mic pre-spikes, or the brittle edges of overprocessed treble, without stepping on the music. In other words, the hiss steals attention from the wrong artifacts and hands it back to tone and groove. The craziest part? That occasional crackle you swear you shouldn't like can bump attention the right way. Intermittent clicks act like novelty pings. Tiny, non-musical events that wake your attentional system just enough to refresh engagement, then disappear. You don't want a campfire popcorn in every track, but a stray tick here and there won't ruin the party. It can even make the return to steady sound feel richer by contrast. Micro story. I once muted every click in a transfer, and listeners called it too clean, kind of flat. Put back 3 tiny ticks, and the notes felt more alive. Not better fidelity, better attention dynamics. Now about noise color. White noise has equal energy per hertz and can feel sharp. Pinkish noise, more energy in the lows, less up top, maps closer to how we perceive balance and is less fatiguing. Many vinyl rigs skew toward a pinkish noise shape. Low rumble from bearings, mid-band hiss from surface, little fizz up top once RIAA is applied. Your ear tolerates that far more than a bright hiss blade sitting in the 6 to 10 kilohertz zone where you're sensitive. Contrast this with dead silent digital. When the floor vanishes, all the mix decisions up high are naked. A bright vocal, hyped cymbals, a resonant de-esser. Those elements land on your sensitivity peak with nothing to hide behind. At first, it reads as detail. Then the cognitive load climbs because your brain has to suppress those edges constantly. Add the lightest touch of low-level pink-shaped noise or a dither that's noise-shaped out of the mids, and suddenly the same file feels less surgical and more musical. The music didn't change, the brain's workload did. Here's the weird part. Noise also helps grouping. Auditory scene analysis likes coherence. A stable, low-level hiss that rides the entire mix can cue one thing in one place. When the floor is absolute zero, instruments can feel like isolated stickers on a glass pane. Give the pane a faint texture and the stickers sit in the scene. But let's keep this honest. Not all noise is helpful. Intermittent hums at 50-60 Hz and their harmonics scream electrical fault. Broad HF hash from cheap gear lives right on sibilance and is the definition of fatigue. Record crackle that's frequent enough to intrude breaks immersion. The rule? Consistent, low-level broadbandish noise can help. Narrowband, spiky, or frequent bursts hurt. Dither specifics matter too. Triangular probability density function, TPDF dither, avoids tonal bias and is the standard choice for general-purpose 16-bit delivery. Noise-shaped dither can push perceived noise down in the critical midband and up where you're less sensitive, when used at appropriate sample rates. You won't hear it as noise in a quiet room. You'll feel that quiet passages stay smooth instead of crunchy. If you ever notice fade-out sounding sandy, that's undithered or poorly noise-shaped quantization. Proper dither makes fades glide. Everything clicked when I ran a sterile acoustic recording through 2 passes. One clean at 24-bit, one truncated to 16-bit with triangular dither, and a -70 dBFS pink bed added post. Level matched, listeners called the pink bed version warmer, easier, even though the measured SNR was worse. The soft floor masked finger squeak grit and let the guitar body bloom. In other words, the brain likes a floor to lean on. Vinyl gives you one by default. Digital can add it intentionally and invisibly. Use just enough. If you can obviously hear the hiss during music, it's too much. If you only notice when you bypass it and suddenly the mix feels brittle, you nailed it. Next up, expectation. Because noise isn't the only thing shaping what you hear before you hit play. Expectation, ritual, and the placebo, that isn't. Here's what most people miss. What you do before the needle drops changes what you hear after it does. That's not fraud. That's how perception works. Attention is a volume knob for meaning. When you clean the record, brush the stylus, cue the arm, and sit down, you've already told your brain, this matters. Your sensory system reallocates resources. Distractions dim, microcues pop. The same principle makes food taste better at a table than in a car. Why this matters is simple. Top-down modulation. Your cortex doesn't passively wait for audio. It predicts and then updates. If the context primes special, your brain increases gain on features. It expects to be rewarding. Tone, groove, space, and suppresses what it expects to be irrelevant. HVAC, hum, phone buzz, chores. People call this placebo. In hearing, it's not pretend. It's your attentional network weighting incoming data. The effect is measurable in lab tasks. Attended tones evoke stronger neural responses than ignored ones, even when the tones are identical. Okay, so basically, rituals lower noise in your head. The tactile sequence, sleeve, platter, clamp, brush, creates a mini breathing exercise. It hints that the next 18 minutes have a shape, a side with a beginning, middle, and end. Side breaks are enforced intermissions. That beat gives your working memory a chance to reset, which reduces fatigue and keeps novelty alive. A playlist can do that too, but the turntable bakes it in. Sunk cost plays a part, but not the cynical way you think. If you invested money, time, and effort, you're more likely to sit still, pick a comfortable level, and face the speakers. That commitment boosts engagement, which boosts perceived quality. You're not tricking yourself into liking bad sound. You're unlocking the conditions under which your brain can actually enjoy sound. That's the difference between placebo and modulation. Nothing imaginary changed in the file, but something very real changed in your brain state. Context effect is huge. A dedicated listening corner with album art and reach signals. Listening now in a way a laptop on a kitchen counter can't. Dim lights, a physical object, a clear seat. These cues shrink the task switching itch. Fewer switches equals lower cognitive load, which frees resources to parse timbre, microdynamics, and space. The same rig in a noisy room while you scroll will measure the same and feel worse. It's not the zeros, it's the zones. Ownership and scarcity add meaning. You choose a record, you own it, there's a finite side, and flipping it takes intention. That scarcity pushes you to absorb rather than skim. Meaning changes hearing, because your brain ties emotion to prediction error. When a chorus hits slightly differently than expected, the dopamine bump is bigger if you're invested. Streaming can do this too. Save the album, sit down, full screen the art, but vinyl's physicality makes meaning effortless. Here's the counterintuitive part. Expectation can reduce harshness. If you expect warmth, your brain may downweight sibilant spikes in foreground body. That sounds like bias until you realize it's the same mechanism that lets you hear a friend's voice at a party. You pre-select their timbre template and suppress competing edges. In a clean, silent, hyper-detailed chain, that suppression has to work harder. In a vinyl voice chain with gentle noise and harmonics, there's less to suppress. So expectation doesn't need to fight. It's a partnership between hardware and headware. Micro story. We ran a blind test that we thought we'd ruined. Half the group saw a turntable and a glowing tube pre, half saw a small DC and a black box amp. Same speakers, same level, same room. We switched sources behind a curtain, sometimes vinyl, sometimes a digital file processed to mimic our earlier vinyl voicing. The first round, people in the vinyl room chose the tube path every time, even when it was the digital chain wearing the voicing. When we revealed that twist, groans. Then the second round, with both groups informed, something cool happened. Preferences stayed almost the same. The notes changed from vinyl is better to this one holds my attention, this one feels easier at this level. Expectations set the stage. But attention, not brand labels, drove the call once they knew the trick. Placebo versus top-down modulation matters because one dismisses the listener, the other describes how attention actually changes perception. Under blind, level-matched conditions with identical masters, differences often shrink substantially, though some perceptual effects tied to voicing can remain. The pattern that remains tracks the psychoacoustics we've been talking about. EQ tilt aligns with equal loudness, low-order harmonics, lift mid-band, low-level noise lowers cognitive load, ritual raises attention. So use the ritual on purpose, make digital feel intentional. Build a startup routine. Pick an album. Set a comfortable SPL tied to your room's equal loudness sweet spot. Full screen the art, put your phone away, and commit to a side's worth of time. Call it a virtual side. You'll hear the same clarity benefits people attribute to vinyl, because the real engine is your brain's resource allocation. One last thing. Don't weaponize expectation. If you walk in hunting for flaws, prove this is better. Your attentional filter latches onto edges and misses the music. Flip the question to, does this make me want to keep listening at this level for this long? That's the metric your nervous system actually cares about. And if that answer shows up more often with a record, it's not because you're deluded, it's because ritual, meaning, and modulation are part of the sound. Myths versus measurements, dynamic range and frequency limits. Here's the part that ruffles feathers. On paper, vinyl loses the spec sheet fight. Real-world dynamic range, a good, clean cut and cartridge might deliver 60 to 70 dB signal-to-noise in practice. A properly implemented 16-bit digital master delivers about 93 to 96 dB of usable dynamic range before dither, more with noise-shaped dither in the mid-band. At 24-bit, playback noise is dominated by your room and electronics long before you hit the format's floor. So if more range automatically meant better, digital would win every time. But the key word is automatically. Dynamic range isn't just headroom, it's how that headroom is distributed in time and frequency, and whether your ear can use it. Vinyl's mechanical system compresses and contours peaks in a level-dependent way. Bass excursions are physically limited, HF tracing softens extremes, and surface noise lifts the floor slightly. That sounds like a downside until you remember masking and equal loudness. A modest, smooth floor can hide grit and let mid-band tone ride higher in perceptual contrast. Meanwhile, modern digital often ships as loudness war masters with 6 to 10 dB of crest factor. The format can do 96 dB. The file often doesn't. Listeners then compare vinyl master with life versus flatline digital master and say vinyl is more dynamic. They're hearing mastering and microdynamics, not bit depth. Frequency response tells a similar story. In theory, vinyl can carry 20 Hz to beyond 20 kHz, but the groove velocity falls toward the inner diameter. Stylus tracing becomes harder at very high frequencies, and channel crosstalk in a stereo groove means some bleed, often around -25 to -35 dB between left and right. Many cartridges show mild HF roll-off or resonant bumps. Tone-arm cartridge resonance lives in subsonic territory that affects stability. Add inner groove distortion, where the wavelength per cycle shrinks, and you get rising distortion on hot, bright inner tracks. By contrast, a transparent digital chain with a well-designed reconstruction filter can be ruler flat from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, with channel separation far exceeding vinyl. Here's the weird part. Those deficits can line up with your hearing sweet spot. A 5 to 1 dB droop above 12 to 15 kHz. At home, listening levels rarely kills air, but it can reduce splash in the most sensitive sibilance band. A smidge of crosstalk collapses the most unnatural hard left/right elements, nudging phantom center solidity. Inner groove distortion is real and audible on hot cuts, but many musical moments land in the mid-band where vinyl's gentle smoothing aids plausibility. Psychoacoustic masking explains why the missing extreme highs aren't missed if the mid-band carries meaning and the top isn't stabbing you. Let's tackle the brick wall filter myth. People imagine digital stair steps and abrupt HF guillotines that somehow ring audibly. The simple version. Properly oversampled DACs use linear phase or minimum phase reconstruction filters to reconstruct a smooth waveform from band-limited samples. Done right, the time and frequency behavior is audibly transparent. Pre-post ringing exists as a mathematical property of certain filters, but at modern rates and competent implementations, it generally sits below perceptual thresholds on real program material. If you hear zingy edges and glare, it's almost always the master, not Nyquist.